The air trembled beneath Rome's marble arches. Cymbals clashed like thunder. Trumpets split the sky. Tens of thousands roared, their voices crashing like a storm against the forum walls. And then, through the noise, came a different sound. Slow, merciless. The scrape of iron chains grinding against stone. The crowd leaned forward. This was no ordinary parade. It was theatre, living theatre. Rome's supremacy on display for all to see. And stumbling at the centre was a queen, Arsinoe IV, sister of Cleopatra, once a ruler, now a prisoner, her crown gone, her wrists raw beneath heavy shackles, bare feet pressing against the cold marble. The Romans jeered, some spat, others tossed laurel leaves as mockery, and in the shadows of balconies senators whispered. They saw the message, they understood the performance. Arsinoe's eyes darted across the sea of faces. Terror, yes, but something else, defiance, a spark that refused to die. Even as the mob howled for her degradation, and above it all Caesar watched. Why? Why would the man who called himself saviour of the Republic revel in such cruelty? Why turn a royal woman into Rome's most prized trophy? Was this vengeance, or a calculated act of power? Before we unmask Caesar's darkest display, if you are drawn to history's forbidden truths, if you seek the shadows where empires reveal their true face, then subscribe now, because what follows will forever change how you see Rome's most celebrated leader. The procession rolled on. Behind Arsinoe came chariots groaning under Egyptian gold, elephant tusks, temple treasures, banners painted with victory. Yet none of it mattered. The crowd's eyes never left the girl in chains. Caesar understood this. He understood symbolism like no poet ever could. By parading Arsinoe, he wasn't just humiliating Egypt. He was declaring, before the gods, before Rome, that no bloodline was beyond his grasp, not even the sacred dynasty of the pharaohs. But Arsinoe did not break. She lifted her chin. Her tears did not erase the flicker of defiance burning in her gaze, and that made her dangerous. Even in chains, she was still a queen. The march reached the forum's heart. Incense curled through the air. Children laughed, mistaking cruelty for festival. Senators studied the mob, weighing their own fates under Caesar's growing shadow. And then, through smoke and sunlight, he appeared. Julius Caesar, laurel crown, purple robe, standing tall on his chariot, basking in the thunder of adoration. His gaze swept the crowd. And then it stopped. On Arsinoe. The cheers faltered. For a heartbeat, Rome itself fell silent. Conqueror and captive, dictator and queen, their eyes locked. The question hung heavier than the chains she wore. Would Caesar show mercy before the eyes of gods and men, or would he crush her completely to prove that even royal blood could be ground into dust? The silence was terrifying, more terrifying than any roar. The silence broke. A roar surged once more, rolling like thunder through the forum. Rome demanded its spectacle, and Caesar had delivered. But this was never just a parade. It was a ritual, a grotesque blending of religion, entertainment, and cruelty. The triumph was Rome's most sacred theatre. Priests burned incense to sanctify conquest. Musicians filled the air with deafening hymns to victory. And yet, woven into these rites, walked the broken bodies of the conquered, living sacrifices, paraded for the amusement of the mob. Here lay the genius and the horror of Roman power. For the triumph was never about the battlefield. It was about psychology. It told every citizen, every senator, every foreign ambassador, this is what happens when you defy Rome. Queens in particular carried a darker symbolism. They were not simply prisoners, they were emblems. Their humiliation was Rome's message to the world. Femininity, royalty, foreign bloodlines, all could be dragged through the streets and ground beneath Roman feet. Arsinoe knew this as she stumbled on. Her chains weren't just iron. They were a script, carefully written by Caesar himself. Every bruise, every tear, every step was staged to burn his supremacy into memory. and the Romans watched with morbid delight. Children laughed at her trembling frame, merchants cheered, their voices fueled by wine and hunger for spectacle. Even senators, stone-faced in their togas, permitted the faintest smirk as they measured Caesar's growing shadow. But beyond the glittering streets, hidden from the crowd's eyes, lay another theatre. The holding cells where queens awaited their fate, cramped airless chambers where once regal women wept into the darkness. Here, stripped of silks and jewels, they were forced to confront the truth. Rome did not just conquer kingdoms, it conquered dignity itself. Some would never emerge alive. Others would be dragged into daylight only to face jeers, whips, or execution, disguised as ritual cleansing. The triumph consumed them like a machine, its gears turning on bureaucracy, its cruelty disguised as tradition. This was Caesar's mastery. Not just the general on the battlefield, but the director of empire's grandest theatre. He knew humiliation was more enduring than bloodshed. A death ended a story, but public degradation, etched into the memory of thousands, turned a queen into a cautionary tale for centuries. And so Arsinoe's shame was not her own. It was designed for her sister Cleopatra, for Egypt, for every monarch who dared wonder if their throne could stand against Rome's legions. The crowd laughed as she passed, the sound echoing off marble walls. But somewhere, in the darkness of those holding cells, another queen sobbed, her voice muffled, her despair drowned by the noise of empire. Her tears did not reach the crowd, only their laughter did, and in that dissonance, the true horror of Rome revealed itself. For the worst was yet to come. The laughter faded, but the cruelty did not. For Rome's triumphs were never content with humiliation alone. They demanded blood, and Caesar, master of theatre, understood this hunger. He gave the people what they craved, not just victory, but death staged as spectacle. Some captives were dragged into the amphitheatre, their regal titles stripped, their bodies forced into gladiatorial combat. Queens, women once draped in silk who had ruled from marble thrones, were paraded in rags before jeering crowds. They were no longer monarchs, they were props. Their suffering became the climax of the performance, their deaths the final punctuation mark of conquest. Others faced quieter, swifter ends. A knife in the dark, a garrote slipped around the throat, bodies dumped into the Tiber, erased from record as if they had never lived. But whispers lingered. The people of Rome knew, and the knowledge deepened their fear of Caesar's reach. Arsinoe was different. She walked the triumphal path with chains at her wrists and terror in her eyes. Yet unlike the others, she did not know if she was destined for the sword, the amphitheatre, or some fate even darker. Her uncertainty was its own torment. Every step she took in Rome's streets was a step closer to annihilation. Yet Caesar withheld the final blow. This was his genius, his cruelty. A swift execution would silence her. But by keeping her alive, on display, suspended in dread, he multiplied her suffering. Her very existence became a question mark, hanging over the crowd, over Cleopatra, over Egypt itself. And so Arsinoe's fate was discussed in whispers through Rome. Would she bleed in the sand of the arena? Would she hang from a Roman cross? Or would Caesar invent something new, something more unforgettable? One queen, less fortunate, was strangled in secret, her body discarded into the river's dark current. The official records never named her, but the citizens remembered, the whispers of her end seeping into taverns, marketplaces and temples. A vanished queen, erased by decree yet immortalized by rumour. Such was Caesar's power, not just to kill, but to dictate who would be remembered and who would be forgotten. Arsinoe, however, remained, a shadow of suspense in human form. Her chains were more than iron. They were a performance in themselves, a reminder to all of what Caesar could do and had not yet done. And in that restraint lay a cruelty greater than the sword. For death, swift and final, was a mercy. Survival, under Caesar's shadow, was torment. But why? Why was Arsinoe spared when so many others were erased? Was it mercy? Or was her survival designed to wound her sister Cleopatra more deeply than any execution ever could? The crowd's cheers still echoed in the forum. The laughter still lingered in the streets. Yet in the silence of her cell, Arsinoe waited. Every breath was borrowed, every moment a question. Would Caesar end her, story, or keep her alive as his living trophy? The answer would come, and it would prove that survival, in Rome, could be a punishment far worse than death. She did not die. Not in the forum, not in the arena, not in the river's dark current. Arsinoe lived. But her survival was no gift. It was a sentence. Caesar spared her, not out of mercy but calculation. She was exiled, shipped across the sea to Ephesus. There, beneath the towering columns of the Temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the world, she was given sanctuary, or so the records claim. In truth, the temple was no refuge. It was a gilded prison. The marble walls shimmered with divine beauty, yet to Arsinoe they closed in like a tomb. She walked its colonnades not as a queen, but as a ghost. Her crown gone, her throne stolen, her name reduced to a warning. Rome had not killed her body, it had killed her identity. And this was the cruelty of survival. Every breath she took was a reminder of the power that had destroyed her. Every prayer whispered in the temple's silence echoed back with mockery. She lived, but only as Caesar's shadow. Years passed, yet Arsinoe's existence hung like a curse. To Cleopatra, she was a rival who refused to vanish. To Rome, she was a pawn that might one day be played. Even Mark Antony, when he gazed eastward, could not help but remember the forgotten queen who still lingered in Artemis's halls. Her survival was not freedom, it was strategy. Caesar had ensured she remained alive, but stripped, humiliated, powerless. She was a living reminder that he could reduce a queen of Egypt to nothing more than a political ghost. And so Arsinoe haunted history. Her name spoken in whispers, her presence an unhealed wound for Cleopatra, who ruled Egypt but knew her sister still breathed. The world saw Arsinoe not as a monarch, but as a warning, proof that Rome could capture even royalty and keep them alive, only to torment them by erasing their meaning. The temple's serenity mocked her torment. Its priests moved in quiet devotion. Its columns reached skyward in splendor. Yet beneath that serenity, in the shadows of the sacred stairs, Arsinoe's heart rotted with despair. She was neither free nor dead, neither queen nor captive, a paradox, suspended between worlds. But fate would not leave her untouched. For one day, blood would flow where prayers had once been spoken. It would stain the temple stairs, dripping into the marble cracks, and Arsinoe, the forgotten queen, the living curse, would finally meet her end. Not by Caesar's hand, but by the order of another queen, one who feared her shadow more than any army. The triumph ended. The crowds dispersed, but the shadow it cast would linger for centuries, for Caesar had created more than a spectacle. He had forged a blueprint, a policy of humiliation. From that day forward, queens and kings were not merely defeated, they were displayed, paraded, broken publicly so their destruction became more valuable than their deaths. Their crowns were turned into shackles, their bodies into symbols, their suffering into Rome's propaganda. It was a strategy more powerful than the sword. A corpse could be buried, but humiliation, it lived on in memory, whispered through generations, carved into the very identity of a people. And in this, we see the darkest truth of empire. Rome did not just conquer armies, it conquered dignity. It weaponized shame as ruthlessly as steel, and women, queens especially, bore the cruelest edge of that weapon. They were stripped not only of power, but of the sanctity of femininity, of motherhood, of sovereignty. They became emblems of submission, living sacrifices for the theatre of empire. The legacy was devastating. What Caesar began in the streets of Rome became tradition for his successors. Emperors from Augustus to Domitian perfected the art of turning living captives into symbols of Rome's eternity. The triumph was no longer just a parade, it was an execution ground for dignity itself. And yet Caesar's cruelty did not die with him. Its poison seeped outward. Even Cleopatra years later could not escape its reach, for she too feared the power of humiliation. Arsinoe lived on in the temple of Artemis, a ghost in marble corridors, her existence gnawing at Cleopatra's pride. The younger sister, dethroned, humiliated, yet alive, remained a threat. Not by her armies, not by her wealth, but by her very survival. Every breath Arsinoe took was a reminder that Caesar had once paraded her through Rome, and Cleopatra could not endure it. So one day, soldiers entered the sacred temple. They dragged Arsinoe down the holy stairs. Her cries echoed off the columns of Artemis, mingling with the gasps of horrified priests. And there, on sanctified ground, her blood was spilled. The temple floor drank what Caesar had left unfinished. A queen's life ended, not by the hand of Rome, but by the order of her own sister. And so Caesar's cruelty, his theatre of humiliation, outlived him. It infected the very souls of those who followed, staining history with its echo. This is the true horror of empire, that its violence is not always waged with swords or spears. Sometimes it is written on human flesh, in the slow annihilation of dignity, in the cold spectacle of shame. It is a weapon as ancient as Rome, and as modern as today. For humiliation has never lost its power. It still whispers in the chambers of tyrants. It still parades the conquered before the eyes of the world. It still tells us, across centuries, that cruelty can be systematized, ritualized, sanctified, until it feels like tradition itself. And it all began with Caesar, with the day he chained a queen and taught the world that humiliation could be more enduring than death. If this journey through Caesar's darkest triumphs has opened your eyes to the shadows of empire, subscribe for more untold histories that powerful men tried to erase.